It was a fiery clash at the ABC News presidential debate Tuesday night,
Wait a minute, I'm talking now, if you don't mind, please.
with Republican Donald Trump and Democrat Kamala Harris both seeking campaign-altering moments in their closely fought election. It was a combative back-and-forth clash over immigration, foreign policy, and healthcare, but the debate was light on specific policy details, with Trump seemingly on the defensive as Harris peppered him with jabs about his fitness for office. At one point, she goaded him, saying audiences at his rallies often left out of boredom. Trump, who has been frustrated over the size of Harris's own crowds, fired back.
We have the biggest rallies, the most incredible rallies in the history of politics.
Before pivoting into a false claim about immigrants eating pets.
In Springfield, they're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats. They're eating the pets of the people that live there. And this is what's happening in our country, and it's a shame.
You talk about extreme.
There's less than 8 weeks to go before the election and only days until early voting starts in some states. That made this one of the best chances for the candidates to state their case to tens of millions of voters. It was especially important for Harris, as opinion polls show more than a quarter of likely voters feel they do not know enough about her. She entered the race only 7 weeks ago after President Joe Biden's exit. As questions veered toward policy approaches, Harris served up a lengthy attack on abortion limits, a key election issue. Since the U.S. Supreme Court overturned abortion rights in 2022, statewide bans on abortion have proliferated. Women have been denied emergency care, and victims of incest were unable to terminate their pregnancies.
Trump abortion bans that make no exception even for rape and incest, which understand what that means. A survivor of a crime of violation to their body does not have the right to make a decision about what happens to their body next. That is immoral.
However, Trump claimed he believed in exceptions for abortion, a position he compared to President Ronald Reagan. Harris also claimed Trump would support a national ban, an assertion Trump called a lie, while declining to say explicitly that he would veto such a law. The pair clashed over Harris's racial identity at one point, after an event moderator asked Trump about an event in July when he told black journalists Harris had recently, quote, become a black person.
Whatever she wants to be is okay with me.
But those were your words, so I'm asking...
I don't know. I mean, all I can say is I read where she was not black, that she put out, and I'll say that. And then I read that she was black, and that's okay. Either one was okay with me. That's up to her. That's up to her.
Honestly, I think it's a tragedy that we have someone who wants to be president who has consistently, over the course of his career, attempted to use race to divide the American people.
The two candidates are effectively tied in the 7 battleground states likely to decide the election, according to polling averages compiled by the New York Times. During the debate, Online Prediction Market predicted 2024 presidential general election market showed Trump's likelihood for victory dropping to 47% from 52%. Harris's odds improved to 55% from 53%. In a boost to the Harris campaign, pop megastar Taylor Swift told her 283 million followers on Instagram immediately after the debate that she would back Vice President Harris and her running mate Tim Walz in the November 5th election. She signed it Childless Cat Lady, a reference to controversial remarks made by Trump's running mate J.D. Vance.
She did.
The ABC News presidential debate in Philadelphia was full of attacks.
You're going to hear a bunch of lies coming from this fella.
And a series of false claims.
They're eating the pets.
The question now is, who won the debate?
This is what's happening in our...
Immediately following the debate, Democrats and Republicans were quick to weigh in. California's Democratic Governor Gavin Newsom praised Kamala Harris's performance.
From the handshake and the fact she came over and she commanded the room and she put Donald Trump on the defense throughout the entire night.
While Republicans spoke out for Donald Trump. Stephen Miller is a former Trump advisor.
You see him talking about issues that you and your family care about.
Though Trump has said he's pleased with his performance,
This was my best debate. I thought it was very good.
several Republican donors and 3 Trump advisors told Reuters they thought Harris had won the debate, largely because Trump was unable to stay on message.
They're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats.
One of the most striking moments was when Trump amplified a false claim that immigrants in Springfield, Ohio were stealing residents' pets for food.
You talk about extreme.
Republican Senator Lindsey Graham is one of the few party leaders to publicly say Trump's performance was poor, telling reporters it was a, quote, missed opportunity. UCLA anthropology professor Norma Mendoza-Denton says Harris irked Trump at times.
She said world leaders started laughing at Donald Trump. Donald Trump is weak and wrong on national security. Donald Trump was fired by 81 million people. I mean, that's just, playing on The Apprentice, you're fired. So she's just goading him.
But a moment of unity came the following day when Trump and Harris made a rare joint appearance at a 9/11 memorial event in New York. The two were even seen shaking hands. Harris's campaign has challenged Trump to a second round of debate in October, and Trump has responded.
I would do NBC, I'd do
Internet
Fox.
platforms could be fined 5% of their global revenue in a new move by Australia to prevent the spread of misinformation online. It's part of a worldwide push to rein in borderless tech giants, which has angered free speech advocates. Canberra wants to make tech platforms set code of conducts to be approved by a regulator. If they fail to do so, the regulator would set its own and fine the platform for non-compliance. The legislation, introduced on Thursday, targets false content that hurts election integrity or public health, calls for denouncing a group or injuring a person, or risks disrupting key infrastructure or emergency services. Communications Minister Michelle Rowland says it positions Australia at the forefront of tackling a growing international problem.
This bill ensures that digital platforms are accountable for combating mis- and disinformation on their services. The top priority of the government is to keep its citizens safe. Doing nothing to protect Australians from seriously harmful mis- and disinformation online is simply not an option.
An initial 2023 bill was criticised for giving the Australian Communications and Media Authority too much power to determine what misinformation and disinformation is, the term for intentionally spreading lies. The new bill doesn't give the media regulator the power to take down individual pieces of content or user accounts, the minister said. Some 4/5 of Australians wanted the spread of misinformation addressed, the minister said, citing the Australian Media Literacy Alliance. Australian leaders have complained foreign domiciled tech platforms are overriding the country's sovereignty, with the crackdown coming ahead of an upcoming federal election. Meta, which owns Facebook, counts nearly 9 in 10 Australians as users. It has said it may block professional news content if it is forced to pay royalties. While X, formerly Twitter, has removed most content moderation since being bought by billionaire Elon Musk in 2022. The platforms declined or were unavailable for comment. Industry body Digi, of which Meta is a member, said the new regime reinforced an anti-misinformation code it last updated in 2022, but questions remained. Australia's government is also running an age verification trial for social media before setting a minimum age requirement later this year.
Israeli forces conducted fresh raids in the occupied West Bank on Wednesday, and Palestinian emergency services said an airstrike in the city of Tubas killed 5 people. The Israeli military confirmed the strike, which it said hit an armed militant group, but gave no details. Israeli soldiers were seen patrolling the streets of Tubas. Entrances and exits from the city were sealed off. Cell phone video showed military trucks and bulldozers rolling in. The security forces have been conducting a series of operations in the northern West Bank for the past 2 weeks, with extended raids in Tubas, Jenin, and Tulkarm. All 3 cities have a heavy presence of armed factions, including Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and Fatah. In a separate incident in the city of Tulkarm, the Israeli military said troops backed by police and intelligence services killed an armed militant. Residents there reported being forced from their homes. This resident of Tulkarm told Reuters that Israeli soldiers had destroyed his house with explosives and leveled the remains with a bulldozer. Violence has surged in the West Bank since the start of the war in Gaza. More than 680 Palestinians have been killed in the West Bank since the Hamas-led attack on Israel on October 7th. In the same period, Israel's domestic security agency says about 40 Israeli troops and civilians have been killed in attacks by Palestinians or in clashes with fighters. On Wednesday, a Palestinian allegedly crashed this fuel truck into a bus stop near a Jewish settlement, critically wounding 1 Israeli. The Israeli army said the suspect driving the vehicle was shot and killed by security forces at the scene.
Mexico's Senate gave the green light to a controversial judicial overhaul early on Wednesday at a different location after protesters broke into the chamber mid-session. Demonstrators forced their way into the Senate building, intensifying weeks of protests against the reform, which critics argue could threaten the country's rule of law. Proposed by the outgoing president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, the reform calls for the election by popular vote of more than 6,500 judges and magistrates and reduces the number of Supreme Court justices from 11 to 9, with shorter terms and decreased work experience requirements. The debate resumed at 7 p.m. local time after being moved to the Senate's former base. Earlier in the day, Senate President Jose Gerardo Fernandez suspended the session as protesters filled the chamber, calling lawmakers traitors. Mexico's major trading partners, the United States and Canada, have warned the changes could undermine the trade pact of the three countries and negatively impact investment. Obrador and President-elect Claudia Sheinbaum have defended the changes as necessary for accountability and anti-corruption, while critics see it as a power grab by the ruling party Morena. The president of the main opposition party, National Action, Marco Cortez, addressed the government and lawmakers of Morena in a video posted on his X account, demanding they listen to protesters.
Dear friends of Mexico, what's happening here in the Senate of the Republic is a clear symptom that society doesn't think it's been listened to and considered. We demand that the Morena regime listen and not polarize and confront anymore.
However, opposition Senator Miguel Angel Yunes dramatically broke party ranks to back the reform, effectively giving the ruling bloc the votes it needed. Senators voted 86 to 41 in favour of the general approval.
Thailand's new Prime Minister Paetongtarn Shinawatra outlined her government's policy agenda on Thursday. It was headlined by plans to give away $13.4 billion in handouts to jumpstart the economy.
The government will push to stimulate the economy, build trust and encourage spending, in line with mitigating the people's burden and costs, as well as increase job opportunities, where we will give priority to the most vulnerable group first.
Paetongtarn's cabinet was sworn in this month. Her policies include debt restructuring and legalising casinos to draw in investment and more tourists. Paetongtarn said Thailand faced challenges with structural economic problems and vowed to act with urgency to stimulate growth. But the Prime Minister gave no update on how or when the handout of $300 to 50 million people would be rolled out. The government had said this week it would distribute $4.2 billion of the programme to support vulnerable groups later this month. The scheme has been criticised by economists and former central bank governors as fiscally irresponsible. But the government rejects that argument despite struggling to find sources of funding. Ministers insist the policy is necessary to energise the economy as it struggles to grow compared to regional peers. Hundreds of Samsung workers in India boycotted work for a third day on Wednesday. They're demanding better wages and working conditions. The strike has disrupted output at a key consumer electronics facility for the global tech giant. The plant is near the city of Chennai in southern India and makes products such as televisions, refrigerators and washing machines. Sources say it contributes between 20 and 30% of Samsung's annual $12 billion revenue in India. The workers want Samsung to recognise their union and for the South Korean firm to raise wages and improve working hours. Samsung's Southwest Asia CEO JB Park and other senior executives have travelled to the factory in a bid to resolve the protests. South Korea-based Samsung did not respond to a request for comment. A spokesperson for Samsung India said Monday it actively engaged with workers to address any grievances they may have. So far, there has been no labour unrest at the other Samsung India plant in the northern state of Uttar Pradesh, which makes smartphones.
A day-long strike at Kenya's main international airport caused delays and cancellations for hundreds of passengers on Wednesday. Workers were protesting a plan to lease the airport to Adani Group, an Indian company seeking to lease Nairobi's Jomo Kenyatta International Airport for 30 years in exchange for a $1.8 billion investment. The strike ended after the Kenyan government assured a plan to lease the airport would only proceed with the union's approval. The Adani Group, led by billionaire Gautam Adani, operates 7 airports in India. The Kenya Aviation Workers Union says a deal with Adani would lead to job losses and bring in non-Kenyan workers. Kenya's government says while the airport is operating above capacity and needs modernizing, it is not for sale. It says no decision has been made on what it calls a public-private partnership to upgrade the site. Kenya's High Court temporarily blocked the Adani proposal on Monday to allow time for a judicial review. The union and the government have agreed that no one who participated in the strike would be punished.
Parts of Vietnam remained severely flooded on Wednesday after the deadly Typhoon Yagi hammered the Southeast Asian nation with gales and torrential rain. In Thai Nguyen, some 50 miles from the capital Hanoi, residents rowed their canoes through the streets while others tried to salvage what they could of their belongings. This man said it's the worst flood he's ever seen and that the ground floor of his home was entirely underwater. It's a similar situation for this woman who said her property was destroyed in the storm. Officials have reported scores of people dead and missing, mostly from flash floods and landslides. Authorities in Hanoi evacuated thousands of people from their homes along the Red River as its waters rose to a 20-year high. Yagi was the most powerful typhoon to hit Asia this year, bringing catastrophic flash flooding to neighboring Thailand as well. At least 2 people were killed and hundreds stranded after heavy rains swept through 2 northern provinces, swelling rivers, inundating settlements and triggering mudslides, Thai authorities said on Wednesday. And about 9,000 households have been impacted.
The flooding that we have seen.
Thai conservation scientist Pech Manapawit said climate change and disaster mismanagement are to blame for the devastation at hand.
The rain intensity is so high that now we have the new term, right, that called rain bomb, because of the rain intensity that has never before existed. And I think this also overwhelmed our infrastructure that used to perhaps deal with a much less volume of water. And on top of that, we didn't do well enough in terms of preparedness.
Manapawit, who's also a government advisor, said the floods should be a wake-up call for policymakers.
So the government, I think, have to really realize about there's no economy on the dead planet. And now there's so much crisis happening around us. We have to really think differently in terms of driving economic forward.
U.S. stocks closed higher on Wednesday thanks to a boost from technology stocks and despite inflation data that soured investor sentiment early in the session. The Dow added 0.3%, the S&P 500 climbed 1%, and the Nasdaq gained more than 2%. All 3 indexes opened down after the Labor Department reported the Consumer Price Index ticked up in August, in line with expectations. But core CPI, excluding volatile food and energy components, rose slightly more than expected, all but confirming a quarter-point interest rate cut from the Federal Reserve this month and likely dashing hopes of a larger half-point cut. Stocks on the move included NVIDIA, which added 8%. It was helped by a Semaphore report that the U.S. government is considering letting NVIDIA export advanced chips to Saudi Arabia. Meanwhile, NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang spoke at a Goldman Sachs conference Wednesday, touting huge demand for the AI darling's next-generation Blackwell chip. Melissa Otto is head of tech, media, and telecom research at S&P Global Visible Alpha.
You know, I think if I look at Visible Alpha consensus data, coming into Q4, NVIDIA is expected to deliver $2.5 billion in revenues. But looking ahead to next year, that number is expected to jump significantly to about $55 billion. So it'll be really interesting to see what the company guides to in Q4 and what sort of commentary they give about that outlook, because that's going to tell us a lot about the future trajectory of AI.
GameStop shares fell almost 12% after the video game retailer said it had filed for an offering of up to 20 million shares and reported lower second-quarter revenue. The prior evening's debate between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump also played out in the market. Stocks expected to perform well under a Trump presidency fell, including cryptocurrency and blockchain-related shares, as well as the former president's Trump Media and Technology Group, which slumped 10.5%. Meanwhile, solar stocks, seen as benefiting from a Harris administration, rallied, with First Solar adding 15% and Sunrun up more than 11%.
What if robots had artificial muscles? That's the challenge scientists from the ETH Zurich and the Max Planck Institute for Intelligent Systems have decided to take on. Traditional robots typically employ motors to power their movements. Instead, this robotic leg uses artificial electrohydraulic muscles to mimic the action of a human leg. So how does it work? The artificial muscles are oil-filled plastic bags with conductive black electrodes on the sides. When an electric charge is applied, the electrodes attract each other due to static electricity, pushing the oil to one side and shortening the bag. Here is Thomas Buschner, doctoral researcher at the ETH Zurich.
When we activate these muscles, the so-called electrohydraulic actuator zips together, which means the electrodes come closer and push the oil to the other side of the actuator. This leads to a contraction and thickening of the muscle, similar to a human muscle.
A key feature of the leg's design is the antagonistic pairing of these muscles at each joint.
So antagonistic, just like our biceps and triceps, they work against each other. If the biceps contracts, the triceps stretches, and the other way around, the biceps stretches when the triceps contracts.
The advantage? It can adapt to the environment without needing sensors to constantly monitor its angle.
The electrohydraulic muscle is inherently compliant and can be adjusted in its stiffness purely based on the level of voltage that we apply. This is key when stepping on uneven terrain, and because this dampens the motion while allowing for stability.
The research was published in the Nature Communications journal, and while the technology is still in its early stages, the team is already envisioning its potential applications. Buschner imagines a future where battery-powered robots equipped with artificial muscles could be deployed for tasks like rescue operations. The team is now focusing on developing artificial muscle systems to incorporate tendons and joints.
U.S. inflation data released on Wednesday showed consumer prices easing overall, keeping the Federal Reserve on track to start cutting interest rates this month. The Labor Department's Consumer Price Index ticked up slightly in August. Year on year, consumer prices rose 2.5%, the smallest annual rise since February 2021. Grocery prices were unchanged from the prior month, while energy costs, including gasoline, electricity, and natural gas, all dropped. But the so-called core CPI, which excludes volatile food and energy prices, rose slightly more than expected. That was mostly due to high rents and other housing costs, showing that underlying inflation remained sticky. That could discourage the Federal Reserve from delivering a larger half-point interest rate cut when the central bank holds its policy meeting next week. The odds of a smaller quarter-point cut rose to 85%, jumping about 15% after the report's release, according to CME's FedWatch tool. The mixed inflation report followed data last week that showed the labor market was still cooling in an orderly fashion, helping to reduce the risk of inflation reigniting.
Samsung plans to cut up to 30% of its overseas staff at some divisions. Reuters exclusively revealed the news after speaking to sources. The world's top maker of smartphones, TVs and memory chips has told subsidiaries worldwide to reduce sales and marketing staff by about 15%, according to two sources. They said it has also called administrative staff to be reduced by up to 30%. One source said the plan will be implemented by the end of this year and would impact jobs across the Americas, Europe, Asia and Africa. In a statement, Samsung said workforce adjustments conducted at some overseas operations were routine and aimed at improving efficiency. It said there are no specific targets for the plans, adding they are not impacting its production staff. Official data showed Samsung employed 267,800 people as of the end of last year, with more than half based overseas. A source said the so-called global mandate on job cuts was sent about 3 weeks ago. The cuts come as Samsung grapples with mounting pressure on its key units. Its chip business has been slower than its rivals in recovering from a severe downturn in the industry, and profits at the unit hit a 15-year low last year. In May, Samsung replaced the head of its semiconductor division to overcome a chip crisis. It aims to catch up with smaller rival SK Hynix in supplying high-end memory chips used in artificial intelligence chipsets. Samsung also faces tough competition from Apple and China's Huawei in the premium smartphone market. It was not immediately clear if Samsung will also cut jobs in its headquarters in South Korea. Job cuts could stir labour unrest at home, and one source cautioned it could be a politically sensitive issue. A South Korean workers' union at Samsung Electronics recently went on strike for several days, demanding higher wages and benefits. Shares in Samsung Electronics traded at their lowest level in 16 months on Wednesday.
OpenAI is in talks to raise a lot more money. A report by Bloomberg says the ChatGPT maker is aiming to get $6.5 billion from investors and $5 billion more from banks. The deal would reportedly see it valued at $150 billion. That would be up almost 3/4 on the figure earlier in the year. OpenAI didn't respond to a request for comment on the report, but the deal would cement the firm's status as one of the world's most valuable startups. The frenzy sparked by ChatGPT has shaken up the tech sector and global stock markets since it was launched less than 2 years ago. A fresh capital injection would also allow OpenAI to stay private for longer. That is something most hot startups now aim for, avoiding market volatility and the regulatory costs of a public listing. Abundant alternative sources of funding, including private equity, have further dimmed the appeal of share offerings. OpenAI has also been able to rely on strong backing from tech titan Microsoft. Recent reports have claimed Apple and AI chip champion Nvidia could join any new fundraising.
Fashion giant Inditex showed signs of bouncing back from a first-half slowdown on Wednesday. The Zara owner reported stronger recent sales of its first autumn-winter collections. It said sales in August and early September saw an 11% boost in constant currency compared with a year ago. That's a brighter signal compared to the first half, where sales growth was almost cut in half compared to a year before, partly due to a wet and cold June in its biggest market, Spain. Still, Inditex reported a 10% rise in first-half profit amid tougher times for fashion retailers in Europe. The world's largest listed fashion retailer posted net income of just under $3.1 billion, despite the headwinds, slightly better than analyst forecasts. The company has fought to stay ahead of competitors such as H&M and fast-growing Chinese rival Shein. It's invested in logistics and technology to deliver fashion trends faster and made efforts to minimise price increases on everyday items. Zara hiked prices more slowly than in the past over the second quarter and less than H&M in the US, according to industry data. Among new initiatives, it will roll out its pre-owned clothing app to the US in the coming months, and it will start live shopping broadcasts in key markets following a successful trial in China. Inditex shares were up over 3% after the update.
We must condemn firmly what was the horrible terror attacks that Hamas has produced. But then afterwards, we have witnessed a series of military interventions by Israel in Gaza with a level of death and destruction that has no parallel in my time as Secretary General. Unfortunately, the institutions we have shown an enormous difficulty in making sure that accountability takes place. We have courts, but we see that the decisions of courts are not respected. And it is this kind of limbo of accountability that is totally unacceptable, and that requires also a serious reflection, namely in the context of the Summit of the Future and in the context of all attempts to do a serious reform of our institutions.
An expansion of attacks from Russia, pummeling Ukrainian cities, citizens, infrastructure, with monstrous brutality. And now Putin's further empowering his aggression with the acquisition of Iranian ballistic missiles. So, we're working with urgency to continue to ensure that Ukraine has what it needs to effectively defend itself. And among other things, we discussed long-range fires, but a number of other things as well. And as I said at the outset, I'm going to take that discussion back to Washington to brief the President on what I heard. I know that David's doing the same.
And today I can confirm more than 600 million worth of support for Ukraine, including 242 million this financial year for immediate humanitarian, energy and stabilization needs, as well as support for reform, recovery and reconstruction.